This meeting is being recorded.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Nice, lovely, bright, sunny, late fall day when we finally start feeling like winter is coming. Going to start with the blessing for Torah study. And join me if you wish. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Amen. So I'm going to start with a question that is going to be extremely simple and extremely hard. What is a poem? What is a poem?
To me, it's something that is more, in a way, succinct than prose. And more poetic. Structure, it's uses more visual, more metaphors. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other working definitions of poetry or poem?
I'll suggest the musicality of words.
Musicality, I like that.
I was thinking along those lines also, that poetry has a rhythm to it. A rhythmic quality that's specified line after line after line after line.
A rhythmic quality. Any others? I think one thing that I would add to that mix is that it's a form of verbal play. There is something playful about poetry, just inherently, making rhythm, making things more succinct, or saying something very short, but with a lot of words around it. Biblical poetry isn't always that succinct. It really likes repetition. And one of the things that, looking outside of the Psalms, that really becomes clear is that God speaks in poems when God speaks to humans, for the most part. God doesn't always, but God usually speaks in poems. Poetry is literally divine speech. There's something elevated about it that makes it sacred in a way. So there are a handful of features of Hebrew poetry that are very, very common, that is usually how scholars define what's a poem and what's not, because it's not always clear. But the first and foremost is, as Lloyd said, rhythm. And it's not rhythm in the counting of syllables the way that you might understand from English poetry, or if you study classical Greek poetry or Latin poetry, but it does have a rhythm in terms of accented words. Usually there are couplets, sometimes triplets, with 3 stresses each, but the numbers are not hard and fast. There is no rule with poetry, just like whose line is it anyway. The rules are made up and the points do not matter. other major feature of biblical poetry is parallelism, especially repetition in successive phrases or lines. And I have a Safaria source sheet. If you would like to open it yourself, it's in the chat. And I will also share my screen. So pardon me for just a second while I do that. So there are three major functions of poetry in the biblical text. These are not the only three, but the three main ones are expressing powerful emotions, conveying wisdom in the wisdom literature, and speaking for God, being the prophetic voice. The other things that come up for poetry related to strong emotion are blessings and curses. When Noah curses his grandson Canaan, it's in a poem. When Isaac blesses Jacob and Esau, it's in a poem. When Jacob gives his farewell song, which is both blessing and not so blessing, depending on the son, to his sons, it's in a poem. Moses also uses a farewell song, a farewell poem. Shir Shirim is literally one giant poem. We have some psalm-like songs and prayers. Jonah, when in Jonah chapter 2, and also 1 Samuel 2, when Hannah is giving thanks for being able to conceive and I believe birth Samuel the prophet. And there are poetic elements in every single one of the biblical books. I don't know that we can say concretely that there are poems in every single biblical book. But the only one that immediately springs to mind that would be questionable would actually be the book of Esther. So expressing powerful emotions. One of the first things I learned about biblical poetry is that the very first thing that the human says, the very first utterance of the human is in fact a poem. And it is this quote that I'm sharing right now, Genesis 2:23. This one at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for from a human was she taken. I had a professor in undergrad who actually cited this as the prime example of Hebrew poetry because it was in fact the first example of Hebrew poetry chronologically in the biblical narrative. So in this, we see a little bit of parallelism, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. We also see a little bit of rhythm in the Hebrew. Zot ha'am etzem atzmi ubasar mibasri v'zot yikarei isha ki me'ish lukha zot. One of the issues with categorizing biblical poetry is we don't know exactly how they pronounced the Hebrew. And so getting the actual rhythm is difficult. Scholars have made entire careers of trying to tease out, is there a set pattern or rhythm that is the rule that poetry in the Bible follows or deviates from? And no one has been able to nail anything down in a concrete way. This one begins with, instead of having three stressed syllables, maybe only two for the first couple of lines, or maybe it's just one 4-line thing that's broken up. But this is the first poem, and it is an outcrying of, I wouldn't say necessarily joy, but there's joy in it. It's a sense of no longer being alone, and there's no way to say that in a single word, but it is a very powerful emotion that the human, that Adam, the earth creature, the earthling, expresses. Any questions about this one before I move to another example? Or comments? So our next example comes from the book of Ruth. And it appears to be a prepared speech. Ruth apparently, unlike Adam, who just blurted out this poem, Naomi, in bringing Ruth back to Bethlehem, Naomi, not Ruth, has prepared a speech. She's returning to her hometown, and her name, Naomi, actually means something like sweet or sweetie. And she says, my name will not be sweetie anymore, it will be Mara, which means bitter. And her speech, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, for Shaddai has made my lot very bitter. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. How can you call me Naomi when the Lord has dealt harshly with me, when Shaddai has brought misfortune upon me? What do you notice in this poem? Is there any sort of parallelism that you notice? Is there any sort of repetition? Is there any meter in the English? Because translating these things, many translators try to convey a little bit of the poetic quality, even as hard as it can be jumping languages and idioms as diverse as English and biblical Hebrew.
For as much as she doesn't want to be called Naomi, Naomi is mentioned several times.
Yes, yeah. Her name in the rest of the book is still Naomi. Also, what is she saying through this poem? What is she expressing that might not be able to be captured in a prose speech?
Maybe I'll take a stab, but maybe that empty and full, bitter and sweet, harsh, empty. Yeah, misfortune. There's parallelism. I guess that's parallelism.
Yes, yes. We'll see better examples of parallelism as we move on. But she went away full, came back empty. When she left, she had a husband and sons, and her husband and sons both died in the foreign land where they had gone to, I believe, escape a famine. I don't remember precisely, but I believe escape a famine. And the husband and the sons died, and now Naomi has nothing really left other than Ruth, who's tagging on. So it's a way of publicly expressing grief and acknowledging there were 3 of us who left, or there were 4 of us who left, and now there's two who come back, but one of them is strange, and three of the ones who left with me are buried now elsewhere. And so that just profound sense of loss and grief. If she had just said, I'm in grief because my husband and sons had died, it wouldn't convey the same thing in any way, shape, or form. It wouldn't tug at your heart the same way that this poem, this speech does. Any more comments before I move on? So the Book of Lamentations, Eka, is a collection of poems lamenting the destruction of Jerusalem. And I included this one because of a specific feature that it has that you find elsewhere in biblical poetry, especially in Psalms. But one poetic device that was used is an alphabetical acrostic, starting with Aleph and going to Tav, or sometimes going in reverse, sometimes with a letter missing, sometimes with a certain letter doubled, but the general form is there. The first word, Eka, begins with an Aleph. The second verse begins with a bait. The third word with a gimel. And this translation could not capture all of the alphabet. We have alas, and A is often associated in English with Aleph in Hebrew. We have B, bitterly, and then 3 for the word exile. There was no way to put a G at the front of this, so they went with Judah. Translating the acrostic poems can be very difficult. Our Siddur actually has several of them where the acrostic is like the acrostic letter is bolded, and the English translation follows the Hebrew alphabet letter, at least with the sound, with at least a similar sound. I think for a kuf, for a Q letter in Hebrew, in one place there's a hard C sound in English, but the attempt is there. It's just a very difficult thing to translate one alphabetical poem into another. So we're going to leave behind that conveying strong human emotion and look at wisdom for a few minutes. And this one, there should be a lot more clarity to the way that parallelism is structured in biblical poetry. Would someone like to read this for me?
I'm happy to if no one else wants to. But anyone else want to?
Please.
Happy is the one who finds wisdom, the man who attains understanding. Her value in trade is better than silver, her yield greater than gold. She is more precious than rubies. All of your goods cannot equal her. In her right hand is length of days, in her left riches and honor. Her ways are pleasant ways, and all her paths peaceful. She is a tree of life to those who grasp her, and whoever holds on to her is happy.
So perhaps some familiar words there from the Torah service coming out of Proverbs. So what do you notice in this one about the structure in specifics?
It begins with happy and it ends with happy.
Yeah, there is actually a little happy accident, because the poem is longer than this, but um, there is a little bit of something called a chiasmus or chiasm, an X form, where it starts out at one idea, moves to another idea, and then comes back to that first idea, which is a frequent literary device in biblical prose and poetry, having chiasms in words, chiasm in thought, where it moves from A to B and back to A along a set path. Do you notice anything like with the way the verses are numbered within the verses?
There's sort of not a repetition, but like a embellishment, a statement followed by like more information on that statement.
Yes, exactly. So that is classic biblical parallelism, where you have happy is the man who finds wisdom, the man who attains understanding. The idea of the first clause is completed by the second clause. It's actually called synthetic parallelism, if you are interested in the academic terminology, which is to say it's not actually parallelism at all, but it's just, there's an incompleteness to it that the first clause has, and the second clause always comes in to complete it. The repetition of the subject in, for example, verse 14, her value, her yield, and then the description, better than silver, greater than gold. We have A, B, and then A prime and B prime are intensifications of the idea or completions of the idea. The musicality of this as well, if you Eitz Chaim He, where is it? Yeah, her paths are paths of her paths are pleasant ways, and all her paths peaceful. Darkei Noam v'kol nativoteha shalom. Eitz Chaim He lamaka zikim ba v'tomcheha me'ushar. We sing that. We know it's got a lyric quality, a musical quality. It's got rhythm to it that we can feel when we sing it. And it's not just that we've taken words that don't have that and stretched them onto a rhythmic frame. The rhythm is there underlying the frame. The rhythm is the frame on which the music was stretched, really.
It feels like it wants to be sung in a call and response.
Yes, there's actually a good good number of psalms that seem to have a call and response element to them.
There are a few things about this.
Oh, go ahead.
And there are a few things about this poem that strike me. The first thing is it's very sensual. It sort of reminds me of the Song of Songs, the way that describes the interaction between a man and a woman. And the second thing is The female part description is as a commodity, which is just sort of curious. That it's the man describing the woman like a commodity.
Yeah. Wisdom is personified in a lot of the biblical text as a woman. And so there really is a man woman, but also man understanding, like duality, to a lot of these texts. And you know, if you took out the first line and just had a biblical man report, like saying this, her value and trade, etc., you could easily understand it as a sort of blanking on the word I want, but that laudation of those qualities, like you see in Eshet Chayil, the woman of valor, traditionally read or recited from a husband to a wife on Shabbat evening, also comes from Proverbs. It is a poem that comes out of Proverbs. And so this being in Proverbs as well, that woman of valor and wisdom being sort of the same thing. Just makes a nice encompassing of the idea of what was valued by the biblical authors in terms of both spouses, at least men to women, and also what was valued just in general in the society. Like we know that gold, silver, precious rubies, she's not compared to camels and abundances of sheep. So there's clearly like they have some sense of wealth that is fine metals and gold in a way that someone who is, say, a pastoralist might not have any interest in, because, well, I can't eat it. It doesn't feed my sheep. And unless I could exchange it for something worthwhile, what good is it going to do me when the famine comes in a year or 2 years or 3 years? Because famines were very common in that part of the world in those days. And there's archaeological evidence that actually looks at that, and our biblical text also says that Abraham left one place due to a famine, went down to Egypt. Isaac left due to a famine. Jacob left due to a famine. The idea of famine making people move around is a common idea. So the book of Job is also a wisdom book. And I don't want to spend too much time with this one. But here again, when I pass through the city gates to take my seat in the square, opens up, Job is talking about how it used to be before everything went bad for him. And we also get at the very end of this, I took one little snippet, but he goes on at length of why all of these good things happened. So young men saw me and hid. Elders rose and stood. Nobles held back their words. They clapped their hands to their mouths. The voices of princes were hushed. Their tongues stuck to their palates. The ear that heard me acclaimed me. The eye that saw commended me. For I saved the poor man who cried out, the orphan who had none to help him. The idea, the wisdom idea that's being expressed here is all this wonderful public acclaim that I had. And the reason is that I saved the poor man who cried out. I helped the orphan. The biblical wisdom, a lot of it has a sense of, if you do justice, if you are righteous, if you enact righteousness in the world, then you are wise, you are acting wisely, and you will get the appropriate rewards. Ecclesiastes comes in to argue with that not all the time do the good ones get the good things and the bad ones get the bad things. But generally, biblical wisdom is this: if you do this justice, then you will be acclaimed in public. So our last category we're going to look at today is speaking for God, prophetic utterances. And this first part is not actually anything poetic. It is just the background. We're going to look at the book of Amos. I could have picked just as easily any one of the 12 minor prophets because they are all extremely poetic. But Amos is particularly interesting because of how it begins. So Amos is a sheep herder from Tekoa, which is in the kingdom of Judah. This is when Israel and Judah were separate kingdoms, Israel in the north, Judah in the south. And Amos prophesied concerning Israel during the reign of King Uzziah of Judah and Jeroboam, son of Joash of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake, which is helpful in dating, but none of us know exactly when the earthquake was, or which earthquake is meant. So that is who Amos is. Amos is a shepherd who's from the south, who goes to the northern kingdom and prophesies. So the very first thing that Amos proclaims is a very simple poem, or an introduction to a longer poem, really. The Lord roars from Zion, shouts aloud from Jerusalem, and the pastures of the shepherd shall languish, and the summit of Carmel shall wither. Do you see parallelism here? We have the subject, the action, and the location in verse 2, or in the first two lines. God roaring from Zion, God being implied there, shouting aloud from Jerusalem. The pastures of the shepherds shall languish, the summit of Carmel shall wither. So what sort of prophecy is this? Is this a prophecy of blessing? No. This is a prophecy of doom and destruction, as so many of the prophets are. It's one of the reasons that we don't read them as often, is they frequently go at length as to the wrath of God pouring out, and Amos will do that here too. But how that happens is the interesting part. The fact that Amos is talking about the pouring out of God's wrath is just happens to show the poetic quality. And in order to understand how the sequence goes, I'll have to go through this whole piece and then show you the next piece, and then we can sort of talk about the two together. So the beginning, Ko Amar Hashem, thus said the Lord, is a standard phrase that introduces poetic speech, divine poetic speech. So for 3 transgressions of Gaza, for 4 I will not revoke it, because they exiled an entire population, which they delivered to Edom. I will send down fire upon the wall of Gaza, and it shall devour its fortresses. I will wipe out the inhabitants of Ashdod and the scepter, ruler of Ashkelon. I'll turn my hand against Ekron, and the Philistines shall perish to the last man. In the end, it says, said the Lord God, which is in this case Amar, and literally Adonai Hashem. There are frequently different phrases used to note the end of a prophetic utterance, which is Ne'um Hashem, literally an utterance of God. So 3 transgressions of Gaza, and for 4 I will not revoke it. They exile the people, I will send down fire, it shall devour the fortress, and I will wipe out the inhabitants and the rulers. The very next one. Thus said the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Damascus, for 4 I will not revoke it. Because they threshed Gilead with threshing boards of iron, I will send down fire upon the palace of Hazael, that shall devour the fortress of Ben-Hadad. I will break the gate bars of Damascus, and wipe out the inhabitants from the vale of Aven. The sceptered ruler of Beth Eden, the people of Aram shall be exiled to Kir, said the Lord. So with these 2, Gaza and Damascus, they're capital cities who might not yet actually have been truly capital cities. They might have been in that early city-state stage before it became a nation state. But we get for 3 transgressions of the place, and for 4 I will not revoke it. For 3 transgressions of the place, and for 4 I will not revoke it. And then we get a principal sin, followed with, I will send down fire upon the and it shall devour the fortress. And then further explanation of what will happen to the people. So the parallelism there isn't necessarily line by line. It's here's a block of idea, here's a parallel block of idea, and we will move to another parallel block of idea. The sequence continues through several additional countries. I didn't want to show you all of them. But here is the penultimate one. Get that closed. Thus said the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Judah, and for 4 I will not revoke it. So Amos is in Israel. He's been pointing at all the countries around them saying, and this is how you behaved badly, and God will destroy you in this way, and this is how you've misbehaved, and here's how God will destroy you. And he finally whirls around and is pointing at Judah. And for 3 transgressions of Judah, and for 4 I will not revoke it, because they have spurned the teaching of the Lord and have not observed God's laws. They're beguiled by the delusions after which their fathers walked. I will send down fire upon Judah, and it shall devour the fortresses of Jerusalem. And that's where Judah's thing ends. Judah doesn't have that further explanation of what's going to happen to the people. Which we have this strong repetition through, I think, 7 countries, ending with Judah. And then Amos wheels around to talk to the people he's actually prophesying at, to, and against. For 3 transgressions of Israel, and for 4 I will not revoke it. And then we get this massive list. They have sold for silver those whose cause was just, and the needy for a pair of sandals. You who trample the heads of the poor into the dust of the ground and make the humble walk a twisted course. There is a list of successive grievances God has with their behavior. And God says, but I destroyed the Amorites for you. And I did this, I brought you from the land of Egypt. And this one doesn't end with the prophecy of destruction that comes after I had to cut it off at some point because it continues for a ways. So we have for 3 transgressions and for 4 I will not revoke it. setting up this parallel. And what happens here with Israel, the prime target that Amos is talking about? When he breaks that pattern, what happens? We have this pattern for 3, for 4. You've sinned. I will send fire and destroy this. And 3 transgressions, and for 4. And then we get this massive list. What effect does that have?
Well, it kind of highlights Israel after, the others. That's okay, a couple lines, but this really hurts God. This one really hurts God.
Yeah, God is really upset about this. The behavior is no more atrocious than any other place in like objective terms of what the behavior is. There's oppressing the poor, sexual impropriety, oppressing the poor some more, ignoring what God has tried to provide them. And it really elevates. And if you imagine Amos standing sort of on a hillside outside the capital of Samaria and whipping up a crowd, and for 3 transgressions of this enemy of yours, and for 4, God will smite them, and moving around enemy by enemy and country that they are in conflict with, because Israel and Judah were also in at least competition and sometimes open conflict. And then whirling back to the rest of the crowd and saying, and you all. It's a very impressive sermon technique to get everyone in total accord with everything you're saying. Yes, all these things will happen to our enemies. And us? What? It's an attempt to get them to wake up. The repetitions that happen also in this, we do see some in the line by line sort of way. They've sold for silver those whose cause was just, and the needy for a pair of sandals. You who trample the poor to the dust of the ground and make the humble walk a twisted course. There's a connection there between the oppression and the dirt in both those lines. They recline on garments taken in pledge. That would be a garment that you would loan someone some money, and if they were very poor, you could take their garments potentially off their back, at least for the day. And they're lying on those garments and drinking wine bought with fines that they impose. They're oppressing the people on both sides. This is not directed at the common person in the street, really. It is directed at the government, at the nobility, such as it was in those days, at the leadership. But also, the common person is not without some fault in this as well. And the final example I have for the day before we have some concluding discussion is from the Torah, Balak. This is the middle one of the 3. Balak is hired, or Balaam. Balaam is hired by Balak to curse Israel and You know one of them very well because Matovu Oholeka Yaakov, Mishkanoteka Yisrael comes straight out of Balaam's mouth. But this is another one. Up, Balak, and attend. Give ear unto me, son of Zippor. Notice the parallelism line by line there. God is not a human to be capricious or mortal to have a change of heart. Would God speak and not act? Promise and not fulfill? My message was to bless. When God blesses, I cannot reverse it. No harm is in sight for Jacob, no woe in view for Israel. Their God Hashem is with them, and their king's acclaim in their midst. So prophecy doesn't have to just come from an Israelite. Balaam is a prophet who is from a foreign people, but who speaks in this case for God. So it isn't necessarily something that is necessarily tied to the Jewish people either. I mean, Balaam is prophesying about the Jewish people here, but the idea that God would speak to a prophet in another nation and give them some poetic speech about prophecy of destruction, or later prophets we get in Jeremiah and Isaiah, we get some very lovely, beautiful prophecies of consolation, of return to the land, of the everything being calm and peaceful and restored. And we actually read those as Haftarot following Tisha B'Av every year. So the examples of biblical poetry beyond the Psalms that we've seen, the powerful emotions, the wisdom, and speaking for God, a lot of them have the same qualities that you find in the Psalms. We've got the poetic repetition, we've got the rhythms that don't really translate well into English, but writers certainly try. And we have the new thing that we don't see a lot in Psalms, that prophetic voice, that God's speaking in poems. So with these biblical poems, why do you think having a little bit more exposure to them, having a bit more understanding of there's the repetition as part of the artistry, there's rhythm here that I'm not able to see but was there originally, and if I can read Hebrew, I still might not be able to see it, but can understand that it is supposed to be there. How does that change your encounter with a piece of biblical text? Because poems are sprinkled throughout the Torah. They're sprinkled throughout everything. A victory song might be as simple as 6 or 8 words, but it's a micro poem in the midst of the text, not to mention the poetic quality that the prose has frequently as a whole. What does this these learnings, what does that change for you?
I don't know about changing, but it reminds me of just the orality of it and how it makes sense that one of the things we do around Torah is hear it read or Haftorah, and that we have this tradition of cancellation, and it just kind of begs for the spoken voice. So there's not just something that we read and bring in, but that we bring in more senses that we hear.
Ideas expressed through poetry are very powerful and dense. I would say much more so than regular prose.
Yes.
And which brings me to something that I like to do is to read the English when we see the Hebrew text, because I don't, I'm not fluent in Hebrew. I can, read it haphazardly, but I don't understand a lot of the words. But to really understand it, especially if it's poetry, you have to analyze the words. You have to think about the symbolism and the imagery that the poetry is evoking to really get everything that's in that poem, to really understand it within yourself.
Yeah. It is not a quick light read that you can just pick up and enjoy in an afternoon.
Yeah, I mean, the Bible is not a list of things, it's maybe Hashem is a singer.
Yeah. There's poetic qualities to Hebrew throughout the biblical text, just because of how the language itself is structured. And the rabbis taught that God speaks Hebrew. So
I'm struck that the readings are from books that were all written at different times. And maybe, but somehow there's also structure that might carry over from book to book, which is, to me, fascinating.
yeah,
there's some continuity between all those different eras in the history, right?
Yeah, and in Jewish history, there is the biblical text is very poetic, and then once the biblical corpus is finished, there's a real gap in poetry for several hundred years. We get some liturgy during the Rabbinic period, but it isn't really until the medieval Piyutim really get going around the turn of the millennium that we really start to get more Hebrew poetry. And the Piyutim look back at the biblical text and go, okay, we need to do some of these things. We need some parallelism. We need some of that repetition. But they also looked at Arabic poetry in their surroundings and modeled some of their poetry on that. So they were taking the culture as they had it and the culture as they've received it and making a mishmash. And now we end up with songs on high holidays that we sing that are just, they have a bounce to them, like Keter Malucha that we did on, what was it, Rosh Hashanah? So yeah, there's this gap in time where there's not a whole lot of poetry being written, but there are a lot of text that is being written, and they're very dense with ideas. If you've ever tried to make sense of Talmud, there is sometimes a lot more not being said in a single word than being said. And so in some way, it has a poetic feel to it because of that.
Well, I'm definitely going to pay closer attention. And typically in our contemporary lives, you're told when poetry is coming. Here's a poem, but what you've taught us today is how it's just woven in.
Yeah.
And just to pay closer attention to that lyricism. Yeah.
Speaking as someone who's studied this in a professional academic sort of way, I'm in the middle of my 13th year, I believe. I am still surprised when I catch a poetic snippet or a poem that I hadn't noticed before when I go to look at a text. the sense of poetry, it only develops, it only increases as you go. And if you are someone who enjoys poetry, looking at the biblical text and looking at a Tanakh and saying, this is perhaps one giant poem in totality. It is, the Torah itself is one giant poem. Like it's awe-inspiring and also terrifying because of how big an idea and how big a poem it is. But it is worth looking at, it is worth diving into. And it is worth, when there's a repetition, using it as you repeated yourself. That actually has meaning. It's not meaningless. It is in fact even more meaningful than when you did not repeat yourself. So those repetitions become ever more important the more you study this. And studying biblical poetry is a joy for me anytime. And I know we're short on time, but are there any final questions or comments?
I know Abraham's trying to speak, but it looks like he's having a hard time with his audio. Abraham, do you want to put something in the text or no? No? Okay.
Wow, thank you. I
Thank you
mean,
so much, Josh.
yeah.
What's your next, you can announce to this group the next thing you'll be teaching?
The next thing that I'll be teaching is, let me try to remember the name of it.
Oh,
I believe it's Down with the Crown is the name, or Down with the Crown, read in a more neutral voice. Looking at the biblical texts, appreciation for and distaste for the idea of kingship and that model of leadership in the Book of Kings and the Book of Chronicles and elsewhere in the biblical text. Moses, in fact, says you will one day ask for a king, and it's not going to be good, but you're going to do it anyway. And there's a mixture of being down with the crown, as in it's cool, and down with the crown, as in pitchforks and torches. And seeing both side by side in the same text can be very interesting.
thank you so much, Josh.
Have a lovely afternoon and enjoy. I believe the Eagles game is ongoing at this point. Thank you for joining me.
Bye.
Bye.